Okay, hello and welcome to my talk, Finding and Using Undocumented AWS APIs. My name is Maurice. I work as a senior cloud consultant and trainer for the consulting company TechRacer. I deal mostly in the serverless and data analytics space, and I'm a member of the AWS Ambassador Program and the Community Builders. And today I will talk to you about some undocumented APIs. As you probably know, there are a whole lot of things that you can do in AWS, and most of the things are accessible through the AWS SDKs. That's the official way of interacting with everything. Those usually work quite well if you ignore the sort of inconsistent API naming, but that's another topic. The other option of doing and building stuff is the AWS console. The AWS console is usually supports a subset of what the SDKs can do, but there's also an interesting overlap here, what the console is able to do that the CLIs don't support or the SDKs don't support. That's what we're going to talk about today. I came up with this topic when I was working on a project earlier this year where one of our customers was bought by a different company, so typical mergers and acquisitions topic where they had to migrate their identity center. The Identity Center, formerly known as SSO, is basically what you use to log into your AWS organization if you have like a multi-account setup and want to use for example, your Azure ID or Entra ID to log in. In our case, the customer already had a setup with their Azure ID, but since the company was being bought, all employees were getting a new account with the new company, and they had to migrate their existing permission structure to the new identity provider. In this process, there is a protocol called SCIM in place that is used by the Active Directory to push users and groups into the identity center, so you can assign roles and applications and stuff like that in Identity Center to the different users and groups. For this migration process, we needed access to the existing SCIM information. There was, however, one problem. I checked through all the documentation, all the APIs. There's no API that is currently public which you can use to find out the SCIM information. But fortunately, the console shows all this data, and what I really cared about is basically this string here. It's just a UUID, and it's the tenant ID for the SCIM endpoint. We needed that for some weird mapping logic, but that doesn't matter too much. The nice thing is that this is information that the console has, and the console is getting it from somewhere. It doesn't make it up on its own. So there's some API under the hood. And since all of this is in a web browser, we can just use our developer tools to figure out what's going on under the hood. I usually don't start with the developer tools when I want to build something, but in this case, there was already no other way, so this is like a fallback option. So we just hit F12, go to the network tab, and refresh the page. And you immediately see a bunch of web requests going from the front end to the back end. Most of them don't really have anything to do with our information, but for some reason, every website feels like it needs to talk to the back end 50 times before it shows anything. So that's something we have to deal with, and this is already the filtered view. As you can see at the top right corner, this is the asynchronous JavaScript stuff. But we can narrow this down even further because the current APIs are all under the SSO namespace. That's the old name of the service. So we only have now a list of like 12 API calls. Before we continue, since we want to make this API call ourselves, we need to figure out what kind of information we need for that. To do this ourselves, we need to know which endpoint to talk to, which HTTP method it wants, what the API operation is called under the hood. Even if it's undocumented, it usually has a name. What kind of headers we need to set for the API to accept our request, what parameters it expects, so the inputs, and also what kind of data we expect as the output. Counterintuitively, we're going to start with the bottom of the list, because we first need to figure out which is sort of our API call, which is the one we care about. So we have to go through our list of API calls and check the response tab in the developer tools. And figuring this out is fairly easy because there's only one response that will include our SCIM information. And in my case, I was unlucky. It was the second to last, so I had to look through quite a few first. But once we find this one, the rest is fairly simple. This output format here is also easy to read. We just have basically an array of provisioning tenants. AWS likes to send us arrays, even if there's only 0 or 1 answers, because you can only have 1 provisioning tenant at the moment. So the output structure is fairly simple. We can find out the rest of the information by going to the headers tab. We'll find our endpoint and method at the top. It's an HTTP post request to a common API endpoint. We can see the headers that we need to set, mainly the content type here. That's something you will find out through trial and error. This is the only content type that AWS accepts for this API. The standard application/JSON doesn't work for some reason. And at the bottom here, the XAMZ target header. That one is very common for AWS API calls. It has the name of the API call you want to do. Many APIs have like a shared HTTP endpoint where multiple API operations are directed to. And this header basically distinguishes between the different API operations. So we have taken care of most of our list. What we still need are the parameters, and those are just in the request. This is basically the payload of the HTTP post request. And we could already see from the content type header that this is going to be JSON data. In our case, it expects the identity store ID. The naming is a little bit confusing in Identity Center. It has, for some reason, 2 API namespaces. Don't ask me why AWS built it that way, but we can get this data from a public API, which is the SSO admin list instances API, so we don't also have to reverse engineer this one. This was convenient. Okay, so we have a long list of data that we collected now. Next step is putting it together and making the request ourselves. For that, I wrote a Python script, because I always write Python scripts. And this has basically 2 parts. One deals with the authentication. That's something I sort of glanced over earlier. In our initial request, we also had an authorization header. That basically contains the signature of our API call. As you know, identity and access management is used to authenticate and authorize every API call. And it does that via the signature version 4 protocol algorithm. So basically, you sign your API call, and you sign the API call with a key that's specific to that region and that service for that specific day. We could implement all of that ourselves, but I didn't really feel like doing that. And if you use the public SDKs, the SDKs already do that for you. Fortunately, there's a nice library called requests AWS 4auth that implements it for the Python requests library. So I could just install that, tell it to use my regular SDK credentials, and then I need to tell it which region I want to talk to and which service namespace I want to talk to. We can get both of those from the authorization header. And for these undocumented APIs, you really need to look into this header because especially the service is not necessarily intuitive. The name doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the API method for some reason. It's a little bit weird sometimes. Okay, so we specify our authentication object, and then we just do our requests.post. So we send a post request to the endpoint that we picked up earlier. We set our content type. We specify the API call we want to make. We include the authentication information, our payload, and that's basically it. And in the end, we just print out the output. And this is our script now. It's just a couple lines of code. We can now include this into our logic if we want. And if we run this, we can see that the output is basically what we expected from the API response from the browser. And in this case, we have our tenant ID down here, and I can easily use that in my scripts. So this is how you can use these APIs. The question is, should you? If you are of the school that you want to automate everything for automation's sake, then this is nice. I think it's also quite educational and a little bit fun to reverse engineer what these things do, but I wouldn't use it in production. These APIs are undocumented for a reason. There is no support. The API may not be stable. It may go away at any point in time. And the data structures may change under you. So In the specific project with our migration, I also chose in the end to not go down this route. We weren't doing the actual migration, it was some operations team, but I decided I didn't want to hinge the success of the migration on this undocumented API. So instead I wrote a short guide of how to extract this information from the console, because it's just a little bit more stable. But nevertheless, it was fun to figure out how it works. That's basically it. If you want to read a little bit more about this, I have a blog article down here that has further reading and links. And if you want to get in touch, I'll be around here. Otherwise, if there are any questions, now's the time. Yeah.
Do you think it makes sense to post an issue available for the PR or whatever to the entity library, such a functionality? Do you think maybe it makes sense?
I tried doing that for another API at some point, but even though they're available on GitHub for some reason, they don't really like you doing that on GitHub. They want you to press the feedback link, and then you ask for it, and you need to tell them why you want to do that. In this specific case, we were doing something a little bit weird. Especially configuring the skim stuff is something that you usually do once, and then you set it and forget it, basically. So I can kind of get why they don't want you to automate that, because it's usually something you should be very aware of if they're doing it. You can break a lot of things that way. And there are also fairly few APIs that are not really supported. Yeah, you could try it, but I wouldn't expect them to change that one. Any other questions? Okay, then thank you.